Last but not least, I believe, if you want to read and change some CSS properties, wow, you can do this. And usually you're going to change classes before you change properties because it's a little bit cleaner to set up beforehand. But it doesn't hurt a bit to do it this way if you want. You can use the CSS function in 3 ways. You can find a current value of a CSS property. You can set a single CSS property on an element. And you can set multiple CSS properties at once. There's slightly different punctuation to do each of those. It can be a little bit confusing. Pick one you're comfortable with and use it for a while until you find what is best for the way that you work. So, to find the current value of an element CSS property, surprise, there's a CSS method. It's nice to see a straightforward answer to a problem. .css is the method. jQuery's CSS function lets you directly read or change CSS properties of an element. So, if we want to take a variable of background color and we want to take and we want to assign it a value of whatever the background color is of the main, probably a div with the ID of main, then this is how you do it. Notice the jQuery selector of $main, anything with an ID of main. Then we're using the CSS function, or actually it's a method because it's attached to an object. And then we're querying for background color. Notice the quotes, notice the dash. There are different places where different punctuation is used, but if you're just directly reading a CSS property, wanting to snag the property, use it elsewhere, just remember in this instance with this syntax that jQuery doesn't understand shorthand CSS properties like background. You could use background color, background image instead of the generic shorthand of background. jQuery always returns RGB values for colors, doesn't matter how they were defined, and it always translates all your unit values to pixels. So just keep those in mind. Now the CSS function also lets you set a property, and to set a property you would supply 2 arguments or 2 parameters to that method, the CSS property name and its value. And remember, jQuery translates to pixels, so you don't need to add, say, px to the end of it like you would with CSS. A little bit picky. This is why there are cheat sheets, and it's why you're keeping up with your cheat sheet, because you want to make note of little things like this. So here we have a jQuery selector on the left. That's a class of pull quote. And we're saying to it to add the CSS property padding of 100 pixels. When you set a CSS property using the CSS function, you can't, when you're setting it, not when you're reading it, but when you're setting it, you can use the CSS shorthand method. The inconsistency here is well noted. But for example, say you can add a black 1 pixel border all around paragraphs with a class of highlight. So we would take our paragraphs with a class of highlight. See that on the left there? The jQuery selector is basically just CSS. We're taking the CSS method and we are using the border shorthand and setting it 1 pixel solid black all the way around. So notice that the left is the property, to the right of the comma is the value. And notice the comma in between them. Notice the quote marks in these parameters. So when you're setting something, you've got quote marks, you got commas, all sorts of things. Now CSS assumes pixels. Just realize that you don't have to add the px for pixels in. It always uses RGB or RGBA. Don't use shorthand to get a property, but you can use it to set a property. Now, say you want to set more than one CSS property on an element at once. not uncommon. Typically what I do is I would add or remove a class at this point, but you can do individual properties. Um, if you think about it, it's going to add these properties in line to your HTML. So it is better to use classes. But in case you need to do this, you would just do it one at a time, like it says here. You have a highlighted div that's ID, and you're just changing the background color and adding a border. You can do them one at a time, nothing wrong with it. But if you want to get a little bit fancy, you can change the syntax you're working with to what's called our good friend, the object literal. Now you think of an object literal as a list of property name and value pairs. After each property name, you insert a colon followed by a value. Each name value pair is separated by a comma, and that whole shebang is surrounded by braces. Now you don't ever have to use this if you don't want to. Object literals are very, very cool. But if it is a little bit confusing, think about it and ruminate on it a little bit, and it will become a handy tool in your tool belt. An object literal for two CSS property values above would look like this. So we have a background color, colon, the value, comma, the border property, colon, and the value for it. Because an object literal can be very difficult to read if it's just all crammed in one single line, a lot of programmers will break it up over multiple lines, and it's basically exactly the same as the previous one-liner. Notice there's a comma on or right after background color, but there's not a comma after border. Don't add extra commas onto the end. Now when you create an object literal, make sure to separate each name value pair by adding the comma after the value. For instance, in this example, the comma goes after the value of red. However, the last property value pair should not have a comma after it, since no property value pair follows it. If you do add a comma, some web browsers, including IE, will always generate an error, which is not something you want to do. Now, object literals, here's another visual of how this works. You have the beginning of an object, curly braces. You have the separators, which are colons, and then on the left-hand side you have properties, on the right-hand side you have values, and if you have more than one, you separate them with commas. Excellent use of a cheat sheet. May I make a suggestion there? To set multiple CSS properties at once. You can do them one at a time. There's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong at all. But a little bit easier, at least more efficient, more economical way of doing it is to use jQuery's built-in chaining ability. Now, chaining is applying several jQuery functions to a single collection of elements by adding that function to the end of a shorter function, like this. When you chain them together, you're just saying .css property value and .css property value. You could chain them together just forever. Reading, setting, and removing HTML attributes. So for instance, we want to grab an attribute, so we'd use the attribute method. The attribute function lets you read a specified HTML attribute from a tag. For example, let's determine the current graphic file a particular image points to. You pass the string source to the function. Awesome. Notice left to right, we've got a variable called image file. It's being set to a jQuery selection that is an image of a descendant of an ID of banner, and we're looking at the attribute source, which is the file on the web server. So the attribute function returns the attribute's value as it's set in HTML. This code returns the source property for the first image tag inside another tag with an ID of banner. It's not going to loop through them. It's just going to find the first one and say, okay, there you go. So the variable image file would contain the path set in the page's HTML, for instance. images/banner.ping if it's a relative URL, or http://www blah 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 if it's an absolute path. And if you pass a second argument to the attribute function, you can set the tag's attribute. For example, if you want to swap in a different image, fairly common thing to do, you just change an image tag source property like so. There you have an image that is a descendant of an ID of banner, and you're taking the attribute of source and throwing in a new one. Remove attribute works exactly the opposite of the previous one. So if you want to completely remove an attribute from a tag, use remove attribute. Remember, jQuery acts on each element in a selection. It automatically loops through a selection. So say you want to take every image and fade it out from a document. You would just say image.fadeout. You can retrieve all the links that point outside your site. That way you can get href attribute of each link. You can add the URL to the other list of links in a bibliography box. So there's all sorts of reasons you might want to take advantage of that looping to create new content or group the content you have. Now, one thing you may want to do, there are plenty of times when you want to loop through a selection of elements and perform a series of actions on each element. Key thing is a series of actions. And to do that, jQuery provides the each function just for this purpose. So we'd have a selector on the left, each on the right, and you take a set of code, multiple lines of code on the right-hand side, and run each of them through it. And to create a collection of code, usually you want to create a function. And in our case, we want to create an anonymous function. An anonymous function is basically a function with no name. I think we've mentioned this before. Same structure as other functions, just no name. So with this each command, you have a selection on the left, and you're going to run a bunch of code through each of these with an anonymous function. So look at this chart as far as the punctuation, kind of get comfy cozy. It's very similar to the one we saw before, where you might have an each method, or whatever method you've got. It's got an opening and closing parentheses, a semicolon at the end of the statement. But inside that, you would have an anonymous function with an open and close parentheses and an open and close curly braces. And that pretty much does that. So this may look somewhat familiar. As you saw before, when you add jQuery to a page, you should use the document.ready function just to make sure the HTML is loaded before the browser executes any of the JavaScript programming. The function also accepts an anonymous function as an argument. Here we go with our anonymous function again. Remember our shortcut? It looks very similar to that anonymous function.